Hey everyone, welcome to the final of the 10-week group theory seminar sessions, Lacanian group therapy. This one is a bit delayed. There were some things that got in the way practically for doing this, but I guess there just felt like there was something lacking, in this presentation, and I really wanted to make sure I found out what that was, which is a joke you'll only get after you finish this presentation. But as we jump into today, this group theory seminar, again, I'll try and introduce and cover a couple main tenets of the theory and do some history overview of it, talk about some of the core concepts related to it, the differences between this approach and traditional interpersonal group therapy, as well as speak about hopefully some pragmatic, practical interventions, traits that you embody as a group leader, and some core change factors that they think of when they talk about this theory. I'll also try and do this from a social justice anti-racist frame, and that's really just to try and be more diversity conscious towards some of the interventions and the discussions that are talked about, as that's something that could be beneficial for us to do in all areas of our work with this. So this book that I use, the primary reference, by Macario, Giraldo. I should know that. I took an institute actually with him at IJGP for I think 7 or 8 group sessions. So I got to experience this firsthand, which gives me less excuse to mess up the explanations of this theory, but it's a complicated one. So we'll do our best to do it. But I read over his book, which is an interesting brief but solid read, and I enjoyed it, as well as the article that he wrote for the 75th anniversary edition of the International Group Theory Journal, the International Journal of Group Psychotherapy, which again is a very nice read in the response to the vignette. So just as a reminder again, the sociocultural transference and context group theories, like most things, often take this individualistic frame, tend to be more white Eurocentric in their origin. And so again, when we read these theories, articles, texts, oftentimes demographic characteristics of the leaders or the clients or group members are not really mentioned, which leaves out a really large variable in respect to how the interactions and the dialogue in and of the group is affected by the sociocultural context. And it's important. Like Lacan will kind of stress this a lot as well. But my hope is to try and integrate some specific examples with some identity factors from my own work, as well as like speaking from my own frame as a white hetero neurodivergent ADHD cisgender male. So I will do my best to be representative and conscious of those factors. And if I miss any opportunities, commit any microaggressions, or just have any comments, feel free to email me. I'm always interested in continuing to enhance my growth in this process. But the too long didn't watch overview for those who want the quick 5-minute gist of this theory. So essentially, Lacanian theory, well, for one thing, when we talk about Lacan, often people tell me that the way you learn about Lacan is by learning from other people that have written about Lacan, because he's apparently very difficult to understand directly. But some of the main concepts that he brings in, it's kind of similar to ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, in that language is pretty key to this. So language, the acoustic sounds that we make with our voices, tied together in particular orders, and it creates the subjectivity of the world that we view. It creates an acoustic image or concept. If you hear the word ishla, then that would make sense. But if I rearranged some of the consonant sounds and put it in the correct order to say leash, then you would have a word that is transmissible and maybe gives you an image that pops into your mind. Whatever image of leash that you have in your head is probably different from mine, depending on your familiarity with leashes, your own leashes that you own, can be very different. And we all know, well, you can say that most people would understand what a leash is, but that we all think of it from our own subjective frame is going to be important as we talk in Lacan, because this intersubjectivity really encapsulates that we have a very limited way of communicating our worlds to one another, and that's through the limitation of the language that we know. The kinds of symbols of our language can never really encapsulate what we lack or what we desire in the world or like within our lives. And it makes sense when I really think about this in terms of oftentimes when my young daughter, Sonia, who's about 3 now, will go to the fridge and say, I want a snack. And she'll, of course, like open the fridge and I'll be like, do you want apples? No. Do you want cheese? No. Want crackers? No. Well, I don't know what you want. And she'll just go, like she's thinking, she doesn't quite know. There's something that she's desiring in that moment. There's something that she's lacking inside of herself that she wants. And maybe it's not food. Maybe it's some kind of feeling of satisfaction or wholeness or fullness. Maybe it's attention for me going to the fridge with her. But whatever it is, she can't quite put it into words. And easy to say when you're a kid, right? Like you don't have the extensive vocabulary as you grow up to be an adult. But I would say most of us find ourselves in a position where we think, I don't even know what I want, or I don't even know why I'm upset. And Lacan would say, oh, that totally makes sense, and you'll never be able to fully encapsulate what you know because you're imprisoned by language and the limitations it has. So you have a other, like sometimes, a mother, like in terms of who raises you, but a mother brings you into this world. And we're forced in this semantic, verbal world to communicate our desire through what we want. When our mothers eventually detach, not because of neglect, but whatever parental figures we have growing up show us that they can't always meet our needs, then we do our best to communicate that. We say, I'm hungry, or, I want to be picked up. I want a hug. Whatever those desires are, we try to encapsulate that. And I see the kind of frustration that my daughter has when she can't quite communicate what she needs at her age. And I think, I talk to clients, those specifically, Lacan's not specifically about like desire in terms of like relationships or sex, although that can be very much applied and useful. But there is an example that comes to my mind of somebody who's feeling really stuck in a relationship and not quite sure what's wrong, not quite sure what they want. Maybe it's a desire for something else different, but they haven't felt what that difference is. And Lacan would say that there's this lost object. An object, again, from that object relations view, can mean human. So, or just like, this is more ephemeral, I think, in terms of object. It can be, again, some kind of image, some kind of felt state. It's not quite certain, not maybe bound by language, but something's lost in childhood, something that is real to you, but is beyond language. And his use of the word real in capital letters there is intentional, because the real is a real felt experience. It's kind of how I take it, but something that I cannot convey through the limitations of my understanding of myself, the symbols I'm given in my culture and language. And I can't communicate it to you or to even like me in some ways. But when we feel it, and maybe when we feel the lack of something, it's very real. It's very felt by us. The symbolic, of course, are these symbols in which we use to communicate with one another. So language, culture, social messages and norms, expectations. And the imaginary is actually not imaginary. It's kind of, I would say, image near me, imaginary. Like in that way, it's when you talk to someone, you're not really talking to them. You're talking to them, and when they say something to you, you only can understand them through your own frame of reference for the world, right? Like if you've never met them before, there's going to be transference where they say something, they look like someone, they remind you of a close friend that you had growing up, they remind you of someone dear to you, they look like an ex, they talk like a humorous comic that you like, but there's these things that we see in them that's transference, right? But also we try and connect that with parts of ourselves, right? So if I see a characteristic in you, it's a reflection kind of me in that way. So we'll get into a little bit more about those details later. The last piece is Jouissance, and this I think is probably one of the most helpful things from Lacanian. There's a lot of helpful things, but I like Jouissance because it helps understand a mixture of tension, pain, and pleasure that I think a lot of us find ourselves in within life, where we feel we're lacking something, but we're kind of like in familiar discomfort, like that we've been in most of our lives. And that is something similar to the repetition compulsion in like modern analytic, where persistently, as we seek and we're looking for this lack of or desire of the other, we find ourselves kind of coping or adapting like in our lives to be in this mixture of tension, pain, and pleasure. So rather than, Freud's drive theory, where it's focusing on, our carnal desires for like sex or murder, things like that. Jouissance is more a sense of, I don't like being seen. I'm just going to use myself as an example, as selfish, and I think there are parts of me that want to be selfish, and so I constantly find myself like giving some things, I don't know, work on this seminar or other things away, like as almost a felt obligation, because I don't want to like hold that selfishness in my mind, and because I do, and maybe I get appreciation and like praise and gratitude from many different folks, and it's wonderful, but there's always a lack. There's always a like it's not enough, or I want more of it, and then because I want more, it feels selfish, right? There's a need for that validation, and then that's that like tension, like pleasure, pain, dissatisfaction, satisfaction. But I think it really helps in terms of if you're thinking of life as suffering and not taking the pain, the sadness, the anxiety, the anger to be a bad feeling or bad experience, then this can be really liberating. And I'll try and explain how that has been for me as I've reflected on these concepts, to hopefully impart how this can be useful for you, or how you could think about guiding clients towards this in different ways, or other people. So Lacan is a French psychoanalyst. He talks about wanting a return to Freud, mostly the idea that people tend to go away from the unconscious parts of Freud, and really wanted to bring people back to that, instead of feeling like, we were going into more behaviorism and other aspects outside of that. So he talks a lot. We'll talk about the mirror stage of development, the mirroring like of your parents, and the dialogues in and of the group, which are both in the group, which is kind of the content level, and of the group, like what's not being said, what's lacking, or kind of spoken about through the different unique uses of language and other words in the group, and speak about jouissance some more. So with Freud, he talks about the talking cure and the unconscious as being intimately tied to language, and Lacan actually gets a lot of recognition from literature, philosophy, and other kinds of areas outside of psychology. But he stresses the unconscious not in the same way that Freud does. Freud kind of sees it as these thoughts and desires tucked away in a box that's not opened, and again, more on the carnal desires way of like, oh, I want to go have sex with people, or I want to like lash out and murder this person, but I push those things down because that's not socially acceptable. But Lacan would say that like the unconscious is kind of something that distorts our thoughts, like our electrons being fed through the tube. And I would imagine that tube is kind of like the language, symbols, and sociocultural like world that we live in. And so everything kind of gets filtered through the unconscious. Kind of talks about like when electrons get fed through a tube, that there's a shift in that for them. So like I mentioned before, the imaginary, symbolic, and real. Imaginary image is kind of like the image of ourselves that we come from others. So our ego is borrowed or learned from our parents. And I would really like to stress again the sociocultural context here as the third metaphorical parent that we all have. No one escapes that parent. And that parent teaches us a lot of things. So we all make ourselves from our others. And this really highlights a lot of the Buddhist talks that we've had in previous sessions around interbeing and wanting to focus on our interconnectedness and less of our individualistic ego that, no, it's because of my specialness and my bootstrap pulling up ability that I am who I am today. Instead of thinking like, no, even if you left your parents in a flight of rage at their abuse and neglect of you, and you made yourself up to be a really successful and powerful person, that there's still them that had the influence on you or other people in your lives who kind of pulled you to be able to become that. But when we're with Sonia, I can see this again, my daughter, all the time. She's constantly mirroring us. And it's really humorous. My wife had a cramp on her foot while we were reading bedtime stories, and I kind of got on her knees and put her foot up so I could rub it to massage it and kind of make the cramp go away. No more than a minute later, Sonia just puts her book down nicely, goes in the same position, and goes, my foot, and just puts it up, saying it hurts. So it just wants me to rub it and says, thank you, goes back sitting to read. It's adorable, but it really does, highlight in terms of her snappishness, like when we say certain things or the ways in which we act, all of it kind of gets mirrored by us, and I think that is really meaningful because when we talk about the individualistic view of deficits in psychology, we often view it as a self-focused problem, like a concrete, singular self, instead of thinking that like actually we're just the ties to the others that we've been through within our lives that have pulled on us. So there isn't a true self beyond the self that is kind of purely born and worthy of love, care, and compassion that doesn't actually self-criticize. So when we use like negative self-talk or self-esteem, there isn't a self-esteem. There's esteem that you get from the systems around you. If you get rejected by a job or turned down by someone you ask out, or like be told that you're not going to pass this round of your dissertation, then that gives you low esteem, and you internalize that because the system told you here's the objective like criteria and you didn't make it, right? Like when we get into these introjections, when people get these messages from microaggressions, Black people in America, people of color, different like ethnicities, and they get these minor cuts that continue to build up over their entire lifetimes. That is, the focused message from the system, the parents, that's borrowed or learned, right? What your worth is, and any culture or symbols, or lack of symbols that you see in terms of like your lack of representation on TV or in music and things, those things all add up to a learned sense of self, right? So I think, again, there's a lot that you can really take from this, from that like diversity-centric lens. And again, as we kind of move into the next section of the symbolic, that symbolic, really, he describes it as a prison, that we're imprisoned by the language that we speak in our culture, family, and allows the child to communicate unique sounds, consonants, symbols to communicate their needs and feelings and thoughts. So I really stress this a lot. And I feel like Lacan and I like really vibe on this. in terms of language mattering, because I think the binary ways in which we see emotions, like in our groups, are key to the ways that we view ourselves and others, because this really matters. When we say, I feel bad, and that means sad, anxious, angry, shame, embarrassed, pretty much anything but happiness, comfort, and safety, maybe pride, like everything else is bad. When you say I feel bad, then we don't want to be bad. I don't want to be bad. Bad's bad. And I want to be good. Good is happy. Good is comfort. If I'm not that, then I'm not okay. And these kinds of things really get us stuck, right? If we're in difficult dialogues and we're, as a leader, we commit a microaggression. If we immediately jump to this idea of, I need to feel safe, I need to feel secure, I need to feel good, then we put up our defenses and we say, I didn't mean that, or here's why I said that. And, and we lose the impact that we had, and we try and boost our sense of worth and happiness, right? So we kind of, again, no fault of our own, these social cultural norms have set, to be good is to be happy, to be comfortable, to be seen with respect, right? And to be bad is the antithesis of that. But if we started to think of the purposefulness of our emotions, which I really think is kind of the point of group therapy, right? Is to own what you feel and then be actually told oh no, there was actually a reason for you to feel that way. It's not just that we're using this medical psychopathological model in our work where we say, oh, you're depressed. We should reduce your depression. We should reduce your anxiety. But we're starting to think of it as well, instead of calling it depression and anxiety, it's not to say that we can't diagnose. It's part of our culture and we need to do. But if we thought of it as sadness, as fear, how would that change the tone or the context? I think there's many times in which I explain that or kind of highlight that to people and just try and talk to them about how these might be emotional states that are important and meaningful to explore. And it ends up not feeling so shameful or burdensome, right? When we say I'm just anxious, instead of saying no, you're not just anxious in social situations. You have a history of traumas and stressors that have told you if I'm vulnerable, I'm going to get betrayed, let down by others, or it's not going to be worth it. And so I've learned to adapt by being more vigilant when I'm around people and holding myself back. And when we see that in group, when we see somebody being silent, being open to noting the experience that we're seeing, but not having it be a sense of you need to change or this is not okay, right? But this is more about honoring that purposefulness of it. So, when we say things also, when we're talking about this symbolic, it makes me think of the word sorry. One of my group members had said that I think in German, they have 13 different words for sorry that can have different connotations. But in English, I don't think we really do. And when people say, I'm so sorry, and they often say it because of things that are completely out of their control. My wife earlier today said, I'm sorry it was so hot. She is not a god of the weather, but she apologized for that. And, of course, most of us take that not as her taking responsibility for the weather. But there's a lot of times in which we use our speech where we do almost inflect, we have ownership of something outside of our control. And I think instead of saying that, just saying I'm sad that it wasn't cooler, that has a different connotation than I'm sorry, right? I wish I could have done this for you, and I didn't want you to feel this, inconvenience or what have you. So just something to think on in terms of how do you think of language? I often get a bit of frustration towards me in my groups because I'm very picky about if they use certain words and making them be more specific with their emotions. I don't accept bad and uncomfortable. I want to know what those mean, what that specifically means to them, what they think is bad, and why is that? So we can kind of start to change that narrative that they've held in their mind around that emotion. So the other with a capital O, again, is the culture, family background that's destined to influence our unconscious upbringing, and also includes all the music, art, rhythms, phrases, names, words, symbols that we're kind of raised in and we take for our world around us. And the real, again, say it's not reality here. It kind of is reality in a sense. It's just not a reality that we can name or understand. And I'll try and give another example of this later on in a symbolic notion. But in the meantime, just think of it again as a part of you that recognizes something is off, or you're making contact with a part of yourself, whether it's your desire or your lack of being, and not knowing quite how to voice that into language. So there's always a tension, right, between the transference of yourself into others, the imaginary, the symbolic, the words that you use to try and convey your needs or your subjective view, and the real, the unconscious or beyond words, like kind of piece that we're speaking to. So the mirror stage, I think you think about me, therefore I am, like instead of I think, therefore I am. And again, it's helpful, I think, because it helps interplay the interconnectedness in this, right? That I am only who I am in relation to other people. If I'm, I remember in 8th grade, actually, there's 2 classes that I was in. There was an English class and there was a drama class. And in the English class and drama class, I experienced 2 very different realities. In the English class, I don't know exactly how they started or what differentiated this back then, but I know that I said some things and I was seen as humorous. I was seen as, quirky, like pretty smart with humor and words, and people enjoyed. And when I spoke, it felt like people wanted to hear me and were listening. With drama, not so much. I was not, maybe not the best actor, for one thing. So that might have frustrated some people, but I know that, like, I would say jokes in drama, and people were largely different in those 2 classes. There wasn't like crossover of students that I can remember. But I would say similar jokes, and I would try and give similar delivery to what I did in the English class with a very different response. People just kind of like looking at me sideways, or just kind of ignoring me or looking elsewhere. And it was interesting, again, because it's very different felt experiences, right? Like one gave me wonderful, like high self-esteem and say like, oh, I can be witty, I can be, dynamic and, kind of go off the cuff and say things and make people like kind of join me in that. And that felt really, exciting. And the other one made me feel rejected, made me feel stupid for like even speaking, or like I was unwanted in that. So I only got that because of what other people gave me back, right? And that, I think, is really kind of what this is speaking to in some ways, that we only think about ourselves in relation to what other people like think about us. So there is a me, but there's no I. There's a moi, but no je in that. And that everyone else around us like completes our sense of ego. That, again, if you were born in a different country, in a different family, you'd be a different person, put simply. So in trying to understand that, we can start to hopefully depersonalize that the way in which we navigate the world, the way that we are, is adaptive and necessary, and not a fault of our own lack of skills, lack of willpower, and trying to, again, depersonalize these individualistic mindsets. So when we talk about the where's my mother or other, like caretaker, the idea, again, when you're a child and eventually you need your parents' attention, that you try to communicate it in the best way you can. You cry, you scream at first, eventually you learn the prison of language, and you get some limited abilities to communicate your needs, but you may never be able to quite fill, and I would say you don't ever fill the void that you desire. which again is fine, actually. I think it was Macario that spoke about, Adam and Eve as, one of the pinnacle stories that we reference in the Bible. The thing that happens with them is they're doing fine and they're in paradise and everything's going super swell until there's an object of desire, right? There's an apple. And then once they take that object of desire, once they bite into it, they become humans, essentially. They become, ever seeking the things that they lack in that way. And so the lack is actually kind of what makes us human. And that's a really different way for me, at least, to view things, because I always, thought lack was the problem, right? Lack is the problem to be fixed, as opposed to lack is part of me, and that's okay. Like I need that lack, and how does that lack actually serve me in some ways? Like I have this desire to not be seen as selfish, and because of it, I do a lot of extra work and try to give back to the greater community. And again, there still is selfish, like there's still a desire to be validated and loved by other people, which again, from self-psychology, I think has been really normalized as just a regular part of human existence, that this is kind of like my oxygen in a way, to get that kinship. But it's still there, right? That's still that lack, that need, and that if that's a driver, then I don't want to get rid of that. Actually, it's a good thing for me to have the lack. And so trying to think of those emotions as being positive, right? You're changing the valence in that way, can be really meaningful. So again, they speak to this idea of we don't learn language, we devour it, it invades us, we become it. It's the only way I can convey to you is through the words that you and I can understand or meet each other somewhere in the between of our subjective experiences. So for Lacan, the ego is this imaginary object, and one that alienates man from himself, and again, leads to distorting or misrecognizing parts of our information. In essence, we can never quite, convey our exact truths to one another in that intersubjective lens. And jouissance, there's that love and pain tension. That's one and the same, that tense position that I mentioned before. That is like familiar pain, comfortable pain in that way, I suppose. I don't think of it like that. It could really be very uncomfortable, but it's like familiar pain in that way. Here's some more aspects of that. So it's persistently sought due to the lack of or desire of the other. And Lacan talks about this in terms of 3 different positions people can take. You can take or leave these, again, like probably more aspects of the times that he was in. But neurosis can compromise in the symptoms between the natural man and ideals, the prohibition and demands of society. So you compromise yourself or parts of yourself because of the societal cultural norms that you're in. Perversion, the subject stays on the side of nature, but is aware that the law of the father or of the culture, land that you're in, and the impositions brought on by the symbolic, the culture, the social. An attempt is made to find a way around the law with that. And then psychosis suffers from being able to make any significant connection to signifiers from the real into the symbolic. So there's a really interesting vignette and story that Macario talks about in his book, and it speaks about a woman who's talking about having recently been released from the hospital and from a psychotic break. She speaks to the group and starts by saying, "So I was taking the dog to the vet, and I'm thinking to myself, as I'm entering into the parking lot, I don't know how to get the dog from the car and not run away into the street and into the vet's office. So I go inside and I ask the vet and say, I don't know what to do with this dog. And they give me a leash to put on the dog and to bring inside. And he gets in there safely, and he gets what I need. And I realized that what I really needed was a leash. And that was really comforting. And now I have a leash on me, so now I feel safe because I have a leash on me. Now, if you followed that story, like with me, it probably sounded pretty normal right up until the point in which she started talking about having the leash on her. Because in this point in the group, everyone felt very discomforted because the symbolic registry, the ways in which we could understand those sentences make sense, the story makes logical sense based on my own subjective reality of the world, and I can visualize myself putting that leash on the dog and bringing the dog inside. But when I visualize myself feeling safe because I have a leash on me, I maybe lost the thread. I'm like, wait, what? What about? Why would I wouldn't want to ever put a leash on me. I'm confused. How does that have anything to do with what we're talking about? And so people got very angry, at saying, you shouldn't have let her in here. She's clearly gone off the deep end, or shouldn't be a part of this group. But Macario, I think he spoke about it from the space of, again, speaking to the leash as a metaphor. And when they kind of understood that symbol in a different context, right? Saying okay, so the leash, you lost your ex-husband, and because you lost him to another woman, you felt like you didn't have any sense of control over yourself. And so now this leash is I need to gain control of myself. I just went through this psychotic break, and it was very terrifying, and the dog was very terrified as you were probably approaching the vet's office, I imagine. And so maybe this is a way of you saying that you need to find some tools, and maybe the group here can be that leash for you. And here we can get through this together. And so it was a way of, again, kind of parsing that into something digestible for the group to be able to take in and feel the relief of their anxiety from this scary unknown of the real, in that sense. I'll give another example later on for this as well. But okay, so Lacan's L schema L, I'm going to be honest, it's really confusing, and I'm probably not going to 100% accurately depict this, but do my best in this. The S is the subject, that is the id in accordance to Freud, so that animalistic, nature of us in the graph. The A, the lowercase a, is the ego, the a other, or the a ego. So that's the learned self-reflection or imaginary. So again, we only learn ourselves through the messages we get from other people, right, in the world. So we learn that from others and from our culture and social context, our familial context. And then the A other is the object or person seen self-reflected in them. So a person that I'm talking to, if I see a part of them and I notice that they seem generous or really kind, then that's part of me that I'm kind of seeing in them that I want to see maybe in myself or in them. So we're kind of having that part self-reflected, in a way. And the A, capital A, other, is the symbol or culture. So the picture kind of depicts, again, there's an imaginary relationship in that we never quite know what we're conveying and not conveying to other people. And I think this uncertainty is really, it may paradoxically sound it's actually really helpful. Because if you start to let go of this idea that I need to know exactly how I'm going to come across, or I have to say something or prevent something from happening in group, rather than just recognizing that this is a phenomenon that there isn't a way to fully ever grasp what this person is going to take from me in that way. And in fact, again, as a white male, I can, be intentional and clear, when I'm talking about oppression or race or sexual abuse with someone, that I have a stimulus value and that impacts people. But I may never know that how exactly that's going to impact them. Even though what I say, the intent of course is me trying to help or try and provide some kind of comfort or reassurance, but I may come across as scary, intimidating, like I'm trying to manipulate them. And that's because of their own like systems and history, which is important, and it's not to belittle that. It's actually important for me to honor that when that happens. But similar to what self-psychology states, this is less about rupture, never having a rupture, and more about repairing and working through and working with what comes up. So focusing on that by giving yourself the acceptance that nothing is ever like concretely seen as it is, and it's less important that you get your subjective view validated of what you meant to say, and more important for you to meet them where their subjectivity lies. If it can be really meaningful within the group process, because that validation is something they probably haven't had in a lot of other spaces in their life. But in between that, the kind of cutoff point is that the unconscious filters of the symbols of the culture and social language that we're tied to. So I think, again, that's a really helpful way of trying to understand these processes. The solid lines and dotted lines, to me, they're more representative of what seems like clear in terms of like how you can recognize that symbols and culture affect yourself, your view of self, your ego, and they also have an effect on the dialogue and the relationship and the context that you're in. But what you can't see is like what's behind the unconscious, that it impacts your like ego, or really like your subject, your id. That's less clear, like in terms of how those things interplay, and the way in which your id may impact the other is also like less certain and clear in that way. So another thing that I thought was an interesting graph, and I kind of made this haphazardly, so apologies for the roughness of it, but if you can see, there's like a straight line, there's a period with A next to it, there's a dotted line, and then there's a B, and in between the A and the B is lack, and underneath is desire. And so demand is kind of with the B, and need is like during the A line. So the representation of this very simple line, I think, is to say, like, whenever there's a demand, there's always something lacking, and there's a desire behind that demand, and that is filling a need. And I think if you start to recognize that in individual and in group, this can be a really useful way of picturing and kind of exploring what the purposefulness is of people's actions that seem shameful, inexcusable, that they kind of deride on themselves. And so when someone, like I had a Hispanic male student who was in a very, very abusive relationship, more so manipulative, emotionally abusive, verbally abusive, and kept beating himself up for saying, like, why do I keep going back to this guy? Why do I keep like wanting this? And instead of thinking like, oh, it's bad for you to want this man and that you shouldn't, do that, or let's talk about ways to go around it, we started to think about like, well, like, let's focus less on him. Like, the demand is to be with him tonight. And let's talk about, what are we lacking right now? What desire are we trying to fill, or need is he filling in us? And if that's, a sense of being loved or cared for, or a sense of being, wanted, then that's important. That's the thing that's behind the object, right? So we think it's like, I want to be with this person, but really that person just represents something else, right? And I think about this, in my own relationship too, when there's inevitably like stress or dismay and arguments. But when you start to think about like, oh, well, things could be better if I just had this, or if I was, with this person, rather than getting caught up in that fantasy, thinking about like, well, but what does that person represent? I know for me, like into our marriage for a little bit, that started to feel like, why am I attracted to these certain kinds of people? And I started to recognize like, well, it's really mostly their playfulness. And that spoke to me like, oh, that's what's missing. That's the lack. Is like, I want and I desire the playfulness and the lightheartedness. When that's filled by like, coworkers or other friends, then I love that, and it's exciting. It's like lighthearted, and so I want more of that. But to assume that the person is going to fill that and they will never have any problems, that's that fantasy that gets people caught up in to like making those decisions to end their relationships or move on. And I think, for me, it's been really helpful, because then it's like, okay, so I can nurture this, right? If it's like playfulness is what I want, that's my need, now I can communicate that and advocate and be creative with my partner to work through that, instead of feeling like that's a them problem, or something that is needed in someone else. So I think, again, like in the group world, it's always important to kind of see, like when we're talking about attraction or what draws people to one another within the group space, to kind of ask what parts of them are they really connecting with or resonating with that is so meaningful. Like, everybody is a representation of another part of you, right? Or something that you desire, like that you seem to lack, that you want to be in that projected self. And so using that can be really meaningful, like within the group space. Hopefully this helps to bring in some like images so people can relate the content with it. This is a lot of hefty theory, and getting a little heftier. This is the Boromian Knot. The three knots are interlaced, and this is like Lacan's imaginary, symbolic, and the real. And so between the imaginary and the symbolic, that's where we get all of our meaning, right? Because that's essentially my image of self mixed with the culture and the social context of the world that I've been raised in. And that's how meaning is formed, like, right? We're really good with that. The object is the object of desire. That is the lack. Somewhere in the between of these three rings is that thing that we will never be able to put into words, is still like, connected to our social, cultural, and familial upbringing. because it's probably something that like maybe we've gained that lack or that desire from those circumstances within the systems we've navigated, and is tied to our sense of self in that way. The jouissance, there's a jouissance and there's a jouissance symbol that I think is more phallic, in that way. That jouissance, I can't remember actually which one is which at this point. I think the bottom one is the phallic one, which is just tension, pain, and desire that is really fulfilling, but really helps us kind of, again, stay. It's like the thing that we settle for, right? Like if I can't ever really truly fill my lack, then I will continue to put myself in this position of, I'm selfish, I give, it's not enough, I feel disappointed, I do more, I want more, selfish, like that tension point. That is the way that we fill the void, is by continuing to stay in that stuck place. And for some of us, that's helpful and really useful. For others, that can be really disheartening, right? If you're in a particularly abusive relationship that feels very demeaning or kind of belittling, and that kind of fits this narrative piece that you felt within your lives of being belittled or not listened to before in life. And it's not that we like it. Again, it's not that we're happy about it. It's like that familiar discomfort compared to the fear of the unknown, which is like that terror maybe of what do I do if I don't have this? Because this has been me for so long. And now if I'm not this, it's like you're telling me to step off an edge and say that actually you're fine. You won't fall. So trying to, again, cope with the terror of asking our clients to do things that go against their roles or their patterns that they've been kind of perpetuating unconsciously, throughout their lives. And again, not taking that as a bad thing in all cases, right? That they're not trying to be as binary in that way, but trying to explore the impact that it has on them and what it's like to try on or to lean against that resistance in the room. So this is an interesting painting that's often used in Lacan's lectures, The Ambassadors. And I'd like to ask everybody, if you're watching this for the first time, to take a look at the painting and just gaze, take a look around, and let's just see what comes up for you. Take a look at the objects, men, dresses, whatever piques your eye, and just notice what thoughts come up into your head. What are you associating? Like, what are you feeling? What are you thinking? And do that for the next 30 seconds or so. As you kind of gaze into maybe their eyes or to the different objects again, there's this gaze at the object of desire that often Lacan references. And so again, your eye is embedded in the gaze of another. There's, I think, a quote in psychodrama, or from the founder of psychodrama, that really stands out to me in this way, that speaks about, I will I will make contact with you, and I will look at you. I will take my eyes out, and I will rip your eyes out, and I will place mine into yours and yours into mine, and then we will see each other. And again, I think it kind of highlights this similar reflection that we are only what we see others that others see us as. If others continue to see us as the little stupid piece of shit, we're probably going to think of ourselves that way, right? That's, again, I think of that drama in English, room story in 8th grade. That is how I would feel in that, and that doesn't actually have to do with me. It has to do with the ways in which the others around me have reflected back to me their views. So one who uses symbols to connect and understand may be a little disconcerted by the presence of the real. Now, in this picture, maybe you've noticed it by now, maybe you haven't, but there's an image in the bottom center that is strange. It's a little distorted, may feel a little odd and unsettling. Now, if you do this, I'm going to try and illustrate this as best I can. If this is the screen, I want you to go as far to the right of the screen as you can, while still being able to look at the screen and try and take a look at that object. And if you do that, what you should see is a human skull that's using some unique artistic technique to stretch it. The way this was set up in the studio was that people would come in initially and see the painting head on, and then they would exit to the right. But as they went further to the right towards the door, and they got further askewed from the painting, like you just did on your screen, they would start to see the skull. And when you see the skull, notice that you really can't make out anything else anymore. And so that's kind of what Lacan is speaking to when it's when you make contact with the real, nothing else really is present with you anymore. You're kind of stuck in that state of terror, of you can call it excitement, whatever unbeknownst to you, you're sitting with. This picture obviously can be kind of symbolic in terms of saying oh, well, when you focus on death, everything else fades away. Or when you finally see death, nothing else really matters in terms of this material possessions or people, whether rich or old, or young and poor. So it's a fascinating, I think, concept in terms of how the anchors of reality go away when we make contact with that unknown terror. And how does this all apply to group therapy? Great question, everyone watching. Hopefully this will continue to illustrate these in more concretized terms, but Lacan and Lacanian approaches to psychoanalytic groups has been kind of expanded upon. And again, Macario, I think, is more of the person who's at the helm and maybe singularly pushing this ship forward in some ways. I know there's some other articles that have been written about Lacanian psychotherapy, but not a ton on groups. So the way that he describes it is two kinds of dialogues: dialogue in the group and the dialogue of the group. And in addition to that, there's the object in desire and the object of desire. So the object of desire is our lost object. And again, that's very ephemeral. Our earliest full satisfaction that's lost. to us that is left a trace that retroactively becomes an object that we focus on as a way of obtaining satisfaction. And so we get all kinds of things in our heads in terms of like what will fill this lack, this hole in me, this lack object. And you know, for a person that I've been working with in the past, like previous years, they had spoken about this idea of like pleasing, you know, their parents and wanting that to be, you know, something that they really strove for in their lives. So they went to several different schools, several different unique accelerated programs, took college courses and majors based on them, and went to different schools based on their, you know, desires. And none of that was actually satisfying or like fulfilling for them. And when they finally came to talk with me about it, they kind of reflected on like, man, I have spent a lot of my life really losing touch with what I really want to do. Like nothing, I don't actually want to do this. Like, and you know, even though I talked about us being a reflection of our, like what our parents teach us, that again doesn't like make us just carbon copies of them, right? Like they tell us what makes you good and what makes you okay or not okay, and like what makes you lovable to them, right? If you get A's, like mommy will be so happy. And so this person kind of saw that this desire to make their parents proud of them was so disheartening and so unbelievably impossible to do, even in the fact that they, you know, didn't get into the schools that they had hoped for, that it continued to push them to overextend and to bend over backwards to that. So that's that jouissance, right? Like I'm going to take double the amount of classes than I normally would, because I'm going to show people that even though I couldn't get into the school I wanted, that I could graduate early because of that. So all of that has, you know, caused a lot of suffering and a lot of disappointment, and tries to get at this thing that can never really be completely filled anyway. So it's kind of a fruitless endeavor in some way, but it feels like it's the energy that drives existence in that way, because it's the one state that's been known their whole life. So contrast that with the object in desire, and that's any object that appears in our lives that catches our longing because it connects us to the object of desire. So if, you know, again, a mother's pride and love is what we really want in this, then the object in desire could be like getting straight A's. That will get me mom's love, like conversely. And so even though it's not mom's love and it doesn't have anything directly to do with her, until I talk to her about it and she like says, great job, it becomes the driving force because it now represents the thing that you lack, or that you were feeling you lack. So lack and desire, again, kind of intertwined in a lot of ways. Desire persists because there's a lack in being, a lost sense of oneness. But again, if we take that lack as part of our natural humanity, then we can stop thinking about lack as the problem and more be curious about what the lack represents and where that string comes from that's pulling us to fill that lack. This theory holds a lot of really wonderful, I think, applications to eating disorder recovery as well. I mean, I think you could use it also like with substance use and other aspects, but in my eating disorder recovery group that I ran at NC State in the spring, it was really meaningful for people to be able to recognize like what, again, often is a reflection of the desire for validation, love, those self-object needs that self-psychology listed previously, but becomes a sense of society and culture and people and parents will not love me if I look this way, if I am this way, and so I will not be this way. I'm not okay if I like stay like overweight, or if I like stay at a regular weight, like and so I will like change that part of me, or I will do everything I can to reduce my like my hunger, my cravings, or like again try to go against what is just our basic human needs in that way, biologically and psychologically. But yeah, the group itself again tends to focus on recreating this in some sense, this lack and desire, because we start to see everybody through a lens of idealization, right? And that makes sense in some ways. People are being safe and they're kind of talking in limited amounts to prevent vulnerability. But I often like asking group members, like, who would you desire to be the most like within the group? Or who in here is someone you admire, and like, why? Why do you admire them? Like, what do they got that's so special? Because like, it's really nice, because then they say what it is, and it's a nice compliment. Actually, they usually resist saying a specific person and go general, but don't let them do that. Get to the specific person. Or at least, encourage and invite them into it. You don't have to, like, you can't force people. And the resistance or adaptation to that is worth exploring in itself. But if you do get them to point out somebody and say, like, I admire this person because you seem so cool and collected, and like you've got your shit together under stress, and I just really, I don't have any of that. I really want that. I wish I could be more like that. Then that person, I think, inevitably talks about, I don't actually have it together, or I do, but the cost to get here was vast and had its own like perils in that process. So you can start to, again, like help people individuate or kind of like break this idealized reflection of themselves that they want to see in the other person through these kind of techniques. The dialogue in the group, people react to one another and to the therapist, and the transference of the imaginary. This doesn't mean the communication's fake. This is actually all of our communication when you really think about it, so it can't be fake. But in the sense that like it's never completely one-to-one, I think that's very true. Group members work to establish a position in the group from the relation that they have to their own ego. And so whatever adaptive stance they took as a child or younger in their life, they will probably find ways to stay in that position, or kind of distort their language or like use language in a way to get their needs met. And again, this can be really frustrating and upsetting, because like I know for me, there was a white male who had come into the group saying that they really wanted connection with folks. And then like through our processing individually, we could tell that there was a lot of trauma, a lot of sadness, a lot of hurt that had happened. And that was often masked through the machismo, masculine kind of toxic masculinity culture in the US. As kind of being like narcissistically like confident and proud of themselves, which is not to deride that. It's really, again, I think makes total sense, like why many people in this country like would shift to that. And when they finally got in the group and they like taken the risk to do that, almost some of the first things they said was, well, I don't trust any of you. I don't really need any of you. Like, I'm just here to kind of help out those less fortunate than me. And so although they really wanted like vulnerability and to be able to talk about their own inner vulnerability, the need to be in that centered position of both being like a combative presence, maybe to the other members, which people have always been against them throughout their lives. So that kind of matched that jouissance in some ways, while also maybe holding a position of power to be able to get away from discomfort, anxiety, the bad feelings of vulnerability, is just what they needed to do in that time. And that's not to say, I mean, at the time, I probably felt frustrated at that person, like, oh, come on, man. Like, we talked about this. Why are you ruining it in the first sentence? But like, honestly, it's what was needed, right? Like that's kind of where we're like talking about in groups, is right, to meet people where they are, and to not hold this expectation that they need to be different or that they need to act differently. If I have, 3 Black members in my group, like male and female, and they are more silent, more withheld, withdrawn from the group dialogue, and I'm doing some bridging, I'm acknowledging the diversity that I'm seeing in the room and noticing the subgroups that are forming. But if they're not like leaning in, it's important to recognize why, like the purpose of that, right? And how I may be contributing to it and owning to that is really meaningful. but not as a way of like, oh, this is not okay, right? Because again, it's not like me as a white person can just wash away a lifetime of oppression and hurt and distrust and like betrayal by different folks that maybe they've come across in their lives, or again, this is like the needed way of taking care of themselves. And so being able to notice that and honor that, I think, is important, not in a belittling way, not in a way that there's ever an expectation that they be different, but like we show up with what is, and bearing witness to people's truths, emotional truths, I think is part of the real powerful element of group therapy in that way. So yeah, that essentially kind of summarizes the dialogue in the group. The last piece just speaks about how the relationship to each member can come into existence, and again presents like a metonymic, like longing for desire, which to me just means people represent certain attributes or feelings or states that we desire to connect with. And it can be really special, right? Like people in group have an impact on one another. And I think in one of my previous private groups, one of the members said, this group is like crack. Like it's so good. And there's so much validation and acceptance. And it's driving me fucking nuts. Like it's going to kill me. Like, because then I leave and I don't have that anymore. And I can't get that. I can't have this with friends like in the real world. I can't have these kinds of interactions, and I long for it so much throughout the week. And that's, it's both a great thing that they have that the group like has come up to a point to fill that, and speaks to how much this is feeling lacking, the sense of validation or like love, unconditional love or care that they get from others in that way. So again, it's not to fix these things, right? Because life is suffering, and we can't recreate group in real life, not fully. But I do think we can be authentic to our experience. We can own our felt truth and recognize that the sociocultural context within ourselves may restrict us, may contort us to respond differently or to adapt based on the situations. But that doesn't have to make us bad or less than. That's more of a commentary on what the system is doing that's causing you to suffer this way, as opposed to I'm wrong or I'm broken, something is not okay with me because I desire companionship or connection with others. In the dialogue of the group, this is the other way, again, in which Lacanian analysts, they pay very close attention to other kinds of dialogue that gradually tend to manifest in groups. So that could be slips of the tongue, momentary spurts of laughter, uncomfortable silences, agitated interventions, lateness, missed sessions, forgetting, different ways of handling payment, compulsive smiling, annoyance. It's the difference between what's the saying in the group and what's said. And the group filters through that like ego. There was a group member in one of my previously run groups in private practice that kept making these allusions. Like there was a new male member that was in the group, and a white woman who had really been working through a lot of anger towards men that have been hurtful in her life, and really empowering and focusing on how she could express anger effectively, had come into this session with this man who's new to the group and really worried about being seen as this toxic man that says hateful or hurtful things to women. But he enters in and, again, starts to say things and things broad enough in terms that the women in the group start to become more silent and start to point out curiosity to the silence. And they kind of highlight the frustration that they're building towards what's being said or what's being alluded to or worrying. I think the person made a comment maybe about an ex-partner, but did it in a way of saying she was crazy. And then that, triggered all kinds of like feelings of anger and frustration and anxiety around, this person's potential misogyny, or like what that could be. And since that is a part of our culture and that is internalized in all of us as well, it kind of highlighted that and made curiosity around that, which was really distressing for the first like couple sessions with that person. But as the group went on with this member, the woman who was working on her anger had kind of been more reserved with this man, but she started doing these quips, and these quips were really not necessary to the group process and kind of like irrelevant. Like in the second session that the person was there, would say things like, "You wouldn't have known this, Mark, but the reason why this person is talking about this is because of X, Y, Z." And constantly kind of like, not just once or twice, but like multiple times in the group would kind of reference that, "Yeah, Mark, you weren't here for this, but this is why X, Y, Z has happened to me." Or "Mark, this probably doesn't make any sense, but to you because of X, Y, Z." So in a way it's like helpful, but it continued to be a way in which it seemed that she was pointing out Mark as an other to the members in the group and to this experience, like that you are a newcomer. And Mark, of course, only being there for one session, obviously knew that he didn't know like some of these things. Some of it helpful in terms of like giving context for stories, but a lot of it felt more like in excess. And so when I brought that to her attention, just curiously, again, like I'm wondering like if you're making anything of this like speech that you're using in terms of like continuing to mention Mark as not knowing these certain things or not being a part of this group. And if that holds any, like if you're holding any feelings towards Mark that you haven't been able to express. And so we were able to get at some of the anger that she was holding on to from the first session that hadn't been fully expressed in that. So certain language phrases, again, bear importance to be viewed. And in my mind, I use this a lot with my emotional expressions. So if people say bad, uncomfortable, or any kind of like negative connotation to their feelings, then I want to highlight that negative connotation and kind of help them rework that to understand its benefit, right? And its adaptivity to it. So I feel bad, I might say like, well, what feeling do you think right now is not okay to have or bad? I feel guilty. Like what feeling is it not okay for? Are you not allowed to be comfortable? Is that why you feel guilty for having taken a vacation? Like, so trying to be curious about that. When people say sorry, when people at the end of sentences say, does that make sense to you? You know what I mean? Just, I say, a lot. I noticed it a lot throughout this presentation. And that, again, speaks to, I think, something behind what I'm saying in terms of like what's unsaid or, the dialogue of the group, right? The anxiety behind that, the desire for validation, the desire to not be given anger, right? I could be wrong, but these kind of prefaces, it's not, again, to point it out as like it's wrong, stop using them, but just to kind of help us be curious with what phenomenon come up. And then you have to be really careful about this, because I think when we make commentary on people as a person and privilege and power, like it's almost certainly has a connotation of negativity to it, right? Even if you just think from a university counseling center perspective of like you are someone who is the leader of the group, and you're in an academic setting in which like teachers often criticize students and mark things that they need to correct. This is different than those experiences, but that's the relation that we often bear it to. So really reinforcing the okayness with these experiences, and to me, like helping reinforce that it's important that we let these things be as they are, because they're really giving us information we wouldn't have had otherwise. And so if you stop talking and you stop cutting yourself off on these things, then we maybe lose some of that information in that. Some people do end up wanting to change those parts of themselves, which is fine if they want to like work towards that, but not to take it from the sense of an obligation or a requirement, or that if there's shame around it, then being able to honor that and normalize that experience. So you make your intention clear in terms of like why it's helpful for you to name Yeah, so dialogues of the group lead members to face their lack of being and the aspects of their helplessness in that way. The interventions that you can use with Lacan. The unconscious is the censored chapter of the client's history created through the social dialogue rather than the biological source. We kind of spoke about that. So be inquisitive of the words, phrases, and signs of the real setting foot in the dialogue. So I often just repeat a phrase that I heard with a curious tone or emphasis and offer the group as a whole a view or a space to digest that and reconsider it. So if they say something like, you know what, I just never felt like I was enough, like around my family, and it's really painful for me to even talk about it. Just saying like, never feeling like you were enough, and letting like that sit with the group, or even like if there's some silence, saying what's familiar about that with folks, like, you know, trying to have people connect with that like thread and where it goes with them. It's a very mindful like intervention in a lot of ways. But I think the focus and the emphasis on certain words and phrases and like highlighting those and sticking to those with an open question or curiosity can be really helpful to kind of help this group stay curious and open to the experience as things come up. Recognizing the reflections of the self, like in others, always initially seeing the dialogue between members. So I often ask my group members, like, what part of someone else in the group do you see as a reflection of yourself? That this is like a fact of life, that you can only see each other through your own lens and relate to each other through what you can relate to in your life or your like, you know, experiences. And so you'll probably see people that will be reflections of a friend of yours in the way that they speak, or, you know, a past part of you that was really nervous and now you don't feel as scared about new situations. But whatever that is, to kind of name it as it happens and to be curious about what that does to you, right? If somebody is someone you view as a younger version of yourself that is more anxious, then you may be more protective of that person. And it's important to name that so we can see it. If you find someone in the group who you see as attractive, then it's important to note that as well, right? Like if we're like physically, emotionally, sexually, whatever, attracted, then there's they're a frame of reference to someone else like in the world, and they may have an impact on you in terms of how you present yourself or how you don't present yourself within the group, because you want to distance from that. From connaissance to savoir, the last bit with this, and connaissance and savoir are like to know, like they're both words in French that both mean to know, but connaissance is like to know like cognitively, and savoir to me is like a felt truth, like I know it like with certainty. So you kind of lead members one by one to their lack of being and how each person in the group organizes their jouissance to confront their having, like what they have, and their being and what they want to be, like their situation in life. So recognizing metaphors and objects of desires they've become attached to as a representation of their early life lost objects that they attempt to reinvent and recapture in that way. And so that I think is really helpful in terms of you know, what really serves us to kind of reflect on within ourselves. For me, I think I'm trying to remember if I have this like takeaway message for myself here. As I kind of mentioned, like there's a quote that was kind of mentioned by Macario in one of his seminars, where he talks about Picasso, and Picasso mentions, like, you know, when I was a child, my mother said to me, if you were a soldier, you would have been a great general. If you were a priest, you would have become a great pope. But because you became a painter, you became Picasso. And there's that sense of, again, like trying to almost recognize that no matter what you do, that there will always be something that you lack or could be, but you're always trying to become yourself in that way, and like whatever your true self is. In this case, that, you know, desire was filled by becoming a painter and expressing it in that way. But focusing on the lack, and lack being important and helpful for your clients, I think will serve you really well, as we will always have things that we lack in life. And this world will not by any means give us everything that we desire. So rather than taking that again as an individual fault or blame, we can start to really help our group members recognize how they seek these things out in their own life and find ways for them to find comfort in the discomfort of breaking or shifting, leaning away from their jouissance that they're so comfortable in staying in. And thank you all for your time with this. I will almost certainly do more group theories in the future at undesignated time periods, because I think this has been very helpful for me and my continued learning. But I appreciate all your watching, and see you then.